Hey there, Chris here from Ielts Advantage, and in this video we're going to look at what the examiners are actually thinking about during the Ielts speaking test. So the examiner's job is to listen to you and then give you a band score in 4 criteria. So those are pronunciation, fluency and coherence, grammatical range and accuracy, I'll just call it grammar from now on, and lexical resource, I'll just call it vocabulary from now on. But there's a range of things that will be going through their mind in each part of the test. And it's really important that you understand what they are thinking about and what they're not thinking about so that you can basically give them what they're looking for and you're aware of what they're thinking about at different stages. Because there's a whole lot of good advice out there and there's a whole lot of not so good advice, and if you're focusing on things that the examiners are not thinking about, then you're not focusing on the things that really do matter. So what we'll do is we'll go through each part of the test. We'll go through the initial greeting, the examiner, part 1, part 2 and part 3, and then we'll talk about the marking criteria. So the greeting, it's not so much what the examiner is thinking about, it's what they're not thinking about. You'll see a huge amount of advice online and YouTube videos and lessons totally dedicated to what to say to the examiner and how to greet the examiner. And this is all nonsense because none of this actually contributes to your score. The examiner does not care what you're wearing, whether you shake their hand, whether you smile at them, don't smile at them, don't shake their hand, say hello to them. They don't care. It's like going into McDonald's and ordering a Happy Meal. Whether you get your Happy Meal or not is dependent on whether you tell them that you want a Happy Meal and you have the money. It's nothing to do with the clothes you have on or whether you smile at them or eye contact or hand gestures or any of those things or your race or your religion. None of that really matters. And why am I talking about this? Because if you are focusing on those things, like I saw the other day, a whole article dedicated to what to wear to guarantee high scores on the speaking test. If you're focusing on stuff like that and eye contact and hand gestures and things like that, it means you're not focusing on grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation and fluency and the things that you need to do well in part 1, part 2 and part 3. So focus on what matters and ignore everything else. As long as you communicate effectively, like you give the examiner your ID and they're able to check that and able to say your name, basically, that's all that really matters. The test doesn't actually start until part 1 starts. So let's have a look at part 1. So I can't speak for every single examiner, but I can speak for myself and I can speak for the fact that we have 12 ex-examiners on our team, and talking to them about this and talking to hundreds of examiners in different centers over the years of teaching. So I'll just tell you what our interpretation of this is and what we're thinking in part 1. One of the things that we would be thinking about in part 1 is, has this person basically memorized a bunch of answers? And this becomes really, really clear in the first couple of answers, but then examiners tend to do something that seems very annoying to students, but is actually there for a very, very good reason. So in part 1, they'll start off with some very, very simple questions. One of the reasons for this is to allow you to warm up and ease into the test. But the other reason is this. A lot of students will come up with very, very, very memorized answers, full of grandiose language and complicated words and complicated grammar and amazing fluency and amazing pronunciation and idioms and all these great things. When you ask them standard questions like, tell me about your hometown or what is your job, and they'll talk and talk and talk and talk, like they'll tell you the history of their hometown and like the demographics of it and whether tourists like it or not and the different types of buildings and industry and all these things, and you're like, okay, so that was a good answer. But then you ask them a trickier question or a question that they weren't expecting. So for hometown, you could ask them like, is your hometown a good place to bring up children? Or does your hometown have good transportation links to the other parts of the country? Or do many tourists visit? Or if I was a tourist, where should I go in your hometown? And if the student has the same level of pronunciation and fluency and coherence and grammar and vocabulary as in their memorized answer or their suspected memorized answer, that means that it wasn't actually a memorized answer. They're just really, really good at English. And that's excellent. But if you ask one of those more trickier questions and they're like, basically that is telling you that I don't have a memorized answer for this. And you're not being judged on your ability to memorize stuff. You're being judged on your ability to communicate in English. And it is a English test, after all. It is a speaking test. You're being judged on your speaking skills and your general level of English. You're not being judged on whether you expected that question and whether you memorized that question. So part one is a great way to judge that, because there are lots of predictable questions, like hometown questions, job questions, where you live questions. And that's often why you'll get people complaining about, like, they ask me a really weird question, like, tell me about your favorite color, or do you think that the weather has an effect on your mood, or do you wear hats? The reason why they throw those in there is to make the questions really, really unpredictable. Because anyone, if you want to, like a lot of you want a band 7, a band 8, or band 9, you might not know a lot about hats or a lot about colors, but you will be able to give some sort of an answer. Like, I don't know, I never wear hats. The last time I wore a hat was this, and so it's not a test of your knowledge of hats or your knowledge of colors. It's your ability to communicate, and you are going to be in very dangerous waters if you have memorized lots and lots of answers and you think that those are going to get you through. And also remember that in part one, the examiner is not judging you immediately. They're not judging you or giving you a band score on your very first answer, or even for the whole of part one. You're being judged on the totality, on all of the answers that you are given. So often I'll be dealing with students, and first couple of questions, they're expecting those and they've no problem, and then you'll ask them some trickier questions and they're just like, oh my god, I've messed that up. I've messed up my whole test, and they just fall apart. And then part two is pretty terrible, and part three is pretty terrible, not up to the level that they are capable of. And that's purely down to nerves and stress. Also, what the examiner is thinking about in part one is they are expecting you to be a little bit nervous and a little bit stressed out. As I said, part one is to allow you to ease into the test and warm up in the test. So if the first couple of answers seem very robotic, or like, you're very, very stressed out and your fluency is not to where it should be, or where you're capable, or the level that you're capable of speaking at, then don't worry too much about it. I don't want to say that part one is not important. It is important, but you're being judged on the whole thing. So let's have a look now at part two. Part two is, some people call it the long turn. It's where you're shown a card and they ask you to prepare an answer for 1 minute and then speak for up to 2 minutes. So this is a great opportunity for the examiner to really think about your linguistic ability. It's a really good opportunity for them to just sit back and listen for up to 2 minutes. And one of the things that because you're speaking for 2 minutes, it's really a great way of testing your fluency. Are you able to speak for up to 2 minutes without any problems? Because if you are speaking for you blurt out a load of stuff for the first 30 seconds and then you just can't think of anything, that's a good indication that you're just not ready to be at the level that you need to be at, or you didn't put enough preparation in, or most importantly, your grammar and your vocabulary are not at the level that they need to be at for you to be able to speak about that topic fluently for the 2 minutes. They're also thinking about your grammar. Do you have enough grammar structures, a range of sufficient grammar to talk about that for 2 minutes? They're thinking about your vocabulary. Do you have enough words to discuss that fluently for the 2 minutes? And they're also thinking about your pronunciation. We'll look at each of those in a little bit more detail at the end. They're also thinking about whether you stuck to the topic or not. If you go off on a tangent and you don't actually speak about the topic, it's an indication that you don't have the language to talk about that topic. Some people do this naturally. I do this when I'm speaking to people. I go off on tangents and don't really stick to the topic. But in a linguistic test, in a language test, they are thinking about these things like, did this person stop talking about the topic and talk about something that they're more comfortable talking about because their language level is just not at the level that it needs to be? And did you fully develop that topic by speaking on that and on that only for up to 2 minutes? Or did, after 30 seconds, 1 minute, you just stop? So that's some of the things that they're thinking about in part 2. Not the only things, there's a lot of other things that they're going to be thinking about, but those are the things that I would be thinking about when I'm working with my students. For part 3 is quite interesting because there are a range of questions in terms of difficulty. The examiner can ask you some of the more easier questions, and then there are questions kind of in the middle, and then there are more difficult questions. So one of the things that students find quite difficult or quite annoying about part 3 is the examiners can ask questions that seem to be unreasonable or really, really difficult. But what they're doing there is they're stretching your linguistic ability. They're stretching to see whether you are a band 6 or a band 7 or a band 8 or a band 9. So if the examiner continues to ask you more and more difficult questions, it's to see whether you can cope with that. And even if they ask you a really, really difficult question and you attempt an answer, but you don't think it's a great answer, don't worry too much about that. You should be happy if they ask you really, really difficult questions or increasingly difficult questions, because it's a sign that they think that you are capable of answering those. If you're, a band 4 or a band 5, they're not going to be asking you increasingly difficult questions in part 3. One of the keys to part 3 is fully developing your answer and your argument. So they're looking for you not only just stating your answer, but justifying that answer, explaining that answer, maybe showing the other side of that answer, giving examples to help you illustrate that answer. So you should be speaking a lot longer in part 3 for each answer compared to part 1. Because part 1 is just about you. It's just normal, everyday, small talk questions, whereas part 3 is more a discussion of ideas. So part 1 about you, part 3 more of a discussion of ideas. So those that you need to be fully developing your answers in that. And I'll not go into specific number of sentences or length of time to speak about, because it differs from question to question. They're also thinking again about your grammar and your vocabulary. Do you have enough grammar and vocabulary to fully develop that answer? So think about someone who is pre-intermediate and you ask them, a part 3 question, they'll be able to give, without much trouble, a short answer, a 1 sentence or 2 sentence answer. But they won't be able to fully develop that and say, well, some people think this and here's why they think it and here's an example of it, but other people think this and here's an explanation of why they think that and here's an example, however I think this. That requires a far bigger range of grammar and a far bigger range of vocabulary. So those are the things that they'll be thinking about in part 3. And in part 3, don't worry about messing up one question. You'll often get one question where you're just like, I have no idea. So don't worry too much if you do that. So those are the things that they're thinking about in part 1, part 2, and part 3. I didn't expect this video to go on as long as it should, or as it did. So I don't have time to go into the specifics of pronunciation, fluency, coherence, grammar, and vocabulary. But what I'm doing next week is I'm doing a full free course on IELTS speaking, which covers absolutely everything you need to know about the different parts of speaking and pronunciation and fluency and coherence and grammar and vocabulary. And we'll also be giving some live feedback. So if you want a little bit more of that, it's totally free. It starts on Monday. Just click the link either above or below this video and I'll be able to share that with you. It's 100% free. You can join immediately. Sorry I didn't have more time. I'm just running out of time and I talked a lot longer than I thought I was going to talk for. So if you are interested in improving your speaking, check that free course out. I'm not cutting the video short because I want you to join the course. I literally didn't expect to be speaking for this long. And I hope that was interesting. And in the comments below, Was there anything in your test that you thought the examiners were thinking about that maybe they weren't thinking about? Or was there something in the video that you were really surprised about or had no idea? Or if you have any questions about IELTS in general, feel free to pop the comment below. Thank you. Bye-bye.